One thing we've learned during the course of the Peninsular War is that you can never underestimate the French. Just weeks after their crushing defeat at the Battle of Vitoria, they're striking back. Can the Allied line hold? Will Wellington's army be forced to retreat, or can the French be contained, allowing the Allies to finally sweep into France and end the war? Today's story really is tremendous and includes the story of the 92nd Regiment of Foot, the Gordon Highlanders, who fight an entire French division to a standstill in what the historian Jack Weller calls one of the greatest feats in military history. Welcome back to the Redcoat History podcast and YouTube channel, the place for military history geeks and people who love great stories of daring do. Today I'm joined by two incredible historians, Colonel Nick Lipscomb and Marshal Beresford. You'll be shocked by the amount of knowledge these two guys have. Now, I know that I'd previously planned to wrap up my Peninsular War season with today's episode, but the content is so good and has so much fascinating detail that I've decided to break it down into 3 parts that I will release over the next month. So be sure to subscribe to make sure you don't miss those. As you'll probably recall, at the end of November 2021, the Redcoat History Show discussed the Battle of Vitoria. And today we pick up where I left off, with the French beaten and retreating. But should the British have been able to crush the survivors and win the war, or were they too distracted by the plunder they'd taken from the French baggage train? Let's find out.
Victoria was a tremendous victory. I mean, it was a very dispersed battle. Wellington's forces were advancing on 4 separate routes. And in fact, the initial attacks by the 3rd and 7th Division had misfired as a result of that. But I think probably too much is made of this business of the plunder and the result of the plunder, which, as some historians have written, had therefore prevented Wellington capturing the 3 armies. I think that has been overstated. Soldiers always plunder. And let's be quite honest. The plunder that was available at the end of the Battle of Vitoria was simply exceptional. I mean, this was the plunder that the French had taken from the central sources of a country that had been the greatest empire in the world. And they had had 6 years to put that plunder together, and it was now strewn all over the valley bottom. Secondly, it's fair to say that up until this point, Wellington never let his army really out of his sight. I mean, even when we then come back to Waterloo, he can put his arms around the battlefield and his army, less for those forces that he pushed out to the west, anticipating Napoleon's maneuver, which didn't come. He's about to find out how difficult it is to expand his wings, in the words of William Napier, for a long flight once he gets to the Pyrenees. And so the concept that Wellington post-Vitoria was going to let his army go and to try and independently operate to try and capture these dispersed and fleeing at this stage French armies, I think is again overstated. Wellington always liked to keep a very firm control of his forces. Fair to say, of course, he did expect a bit more from his cavalry than he got. Some units performed well, others less well. I think what Wellington was most annoyed about was the fact that there had been a significant breakdown in discipline in his army as a result of the plunder. And in fact, had the French armies turned and rallied and, dare I say it, counterattacked, then things may have been slightly different in the wake of the great battle itself.
While in retrospect, this was a decisive battle, I don't think it was quite that clear in the immediate aftermath. And it has been called an unsatisfactory victory. And remember, while the French lost, I think, some 8,000 killed, wounded and missing, the Allies lost 5,500, of which 3,500 were British troops. So it wasn't insignificant in that sense. Of course, the French had lost the famous 150 guns and the baggage train, Joseph's thing, and this caused led to the looting. In terms of whether more could have been done at the actual battlefield, the initial French retreat was quite well managed. I think, and it later turned to a bit of a rout, but it was quite well managed. We've got to remember, in terms of a follow-up, that not only was Clausel hanging around with 14,000 men, but Foy was also in the locality with another fairly large force. So, it wasn't quite as easy as saying, go on to France, boys. This just wasn't, I don't think, quite as easy.
It's fair to say that the British government were pretty convinced that the job had been done. And they were already making arrangements for, if not Wellington's army, but certainly for Wellington himself to move up to the north to join the British force, which had been sent to the Low Countries in earlier part of 1813. Because it's quite clear now that the main effort was going to be in the north. Because, but come the final victories in the south, Wellington's in the wrong place, effectively, because Napoleon, when he abdicates, is in Paris, surrounded by the other three key Allied nations. But victories greeted in London with great celebration. Beethoven writes as TDM, of course. And it was a great victory, but the war was far from over. We've got thousands of French troops, 150,000 French troops still on Spanish soil. Foix, as Marcus has pointed out, up in the north towards San Sebastián. And these troops are now flooding down towards the Pamplona Valley and then up to the passes, the Pyrenean passes, with Gazin, Derlon, and Ré crossing at sort of combination of Maya and Roncesvalles, and Clausel himself heading over the Pyrenean pass at Jaca. So, within a couple of weeks, they're all back in France, and they're not dispersing. They're now moving into defensive positions along the Pyrenees and covering those passes, expecting, quite rightly, a follow-up. Wellington splits his army following the battle. He sends General Graham, Lord Lindauch, with about 25,000, I seem to recall, to head north to pursue Foix and Malcune, who'd gone off with the baggage train up on that northern road on the Béarn Chaussée, as it was known. With the balance of his army, he then pursues the defeated French army that are heading off down towards Pamplona. That's at the point Clausel links up. But he then calls a halt. His army is now spread far and wide. The French have escaped over the Pyrenean passes. It's fair to say that they, in pulling back, had also reinforced the two key fortresses that remained on Spanish soil, that is to say San Sebastián and Pamplona. And in so doing, actually left very strong and very capable garrisons in both of them. Wellington himself really has got to do now 3 or perhaps 4 things. He's got to rest his army. They've covered, hundreds of miles in the preceding weeks. He also needs to move his logistic hub from Lisbon to Santander. And this is a major undertaking and something that takes a considerable amount of time. After all, we're now 5-6 years into the war, and the logistic facilities that are built up for the British forces in Lisbon had been extensive, and that has to now all be moved. It would be rather akin to trying to move Camp Bastion from Bastion into Kandahar, in the space of a couple of weeks. It's going to take time. He's then got to look at either besieging or containing San Sebastián and Pamplona. And Wellington's policy is he doesn't like to leave large fortresses, and both of them have got a considerable number of troops, 3,000 or so French soldiers in each of them, in his rear when he advances forward. So he's got to deal with those. And then in addition, finally, he's got to secure that Spanish-French border with his army. So he's got an awful lot to do.
I think you're right, Nick. Being cautious, he didn't want to leave strong places in his rear with a large French army in front of him and the uncertainty of what was happening with Napoleon in Northern Europe. And we're in a situation where post-Lutzen, Napoleon's in Dresden and an armistice is being declared. And I think he's also wary of a Burgos type situation where he'd really suffered in the previous year.
So he split his force. He's blockading Pamplona. They're looking to besiege San Sebastián. And while this is going on, I understand that Marshal Soult has taken over command of the French forces from King Joseph. What's his moves at this time?
I think Soult shows some pretty staggering efficiency at this stage. The Battle of Vitoria was on the 21st of June. That news reached Napoleon in Dresden on the 1st of July, and he extended the truce on that same day. And by the 11th of July, Soult is down in Bayonne, and that's over 1,800 kilometers. It's 165 kilometers a day. He reaches Paris in 3 days, and his orders are very simple. Push Wellington back across the Ebro. Napoleon needed a victory. He needed a victory to improve his negotiating position in Dresden. And where was he going to find it? And he really hoped that Soult could work a bit of magic down in Spain. And he brought huge energy, I think, to his command, and he reorganized extremely quickly. And he began, interestingly enough, by reassuring his troops that their defeats were not due to themselves, but due to an incompetent command. He abandoned the corps as his basis, and he formed just 3 wings under Ray, Derlon, and Clausel, and he prepared then to go back into Spain. So that's the immediate scenario so far as Soult is concerned.
I believe he did counterattack fairly promptly.
I mean, extremely quickly. I mean, again, he was under pressure from Paris. His plan was the same one, actually, ironically, had been penned by Jourdan. Ray and Clausel were to join forces. They were to attack the pass at Roncesvalles, while Derlon was to attack the pass at Maya. The operations actually worked quite well, it's fair to say. Villars was the reserve with a division plus force, which was then on the coast road heading around the Western Pyrenees towards San Sebastián. And the reason for him pushing forward was, of course, there was a dual aim here. It was to force Wellington to lift the siege, which had started, the first siege at San Sebastián, whilst Soult's main aim with his 3 lieutenancies, each with about 3 divisions strength. And he does this, worth making the point that the reason he gets rid of this groundbreaking, battle-winning formation, the core system, which had been introduced by Napoleon, is because of the egos of these core commanders, which have been really undoing the lieutenants that have been operating in the Peninsular for the last 5-6 years. So these 3 lieutenancies are put together with about 3 divisions in each, and their task, those attacking both at Roncesvalles and at Maya, is to link up after they've cleared the passes, link up and then move on and relieve the blockade of Pamplona, but more importantly, to get inside Pamplona and to get the artillery. There were over 120 field guns, not siege guns. I mean, there was a massive number of siege guns in Pamplona, but and there was a siege train there too. But there were field guns, and these were the things that, of course, the French armies had lost in great numbers following the battle at Vitoria. So he desperately needed those. Now, the attacks from the French perspective are a bit slow, it's fair to say. The one at Roncesvalles gets held up for a very long time. And in simple terms, Lowry Cole, commanding the 4th Division, he had responsibility for the path at Roncesvalles, but behind him, some 5 miles down that track or main track towards the pass at Roncesvalles was Picton with his 3rd Division. And Cole lost his nerve, I think it's fair to say. His troops had done very well, but once the French had got around to the east, there was a foundry there at Orbicieto, which was held by the Spanish. And once that had been captured, it actually meant that the French could start to trickle troops in behind the forward brigade of the 4th Division. And as I say, Cole, as last night, light fell on that day, the first attacks on the 25th of July, he withdrew back. He pulls down the road, it's fair to say, bumps into Picton, and they both decide they're going to pull all the way back to Pamplona.
I'll just pick up there because I think if we look at the other side of the coin, what's happening in Pamplona? Pamplona had originally been invested by Hill and the 6th Division as well. And then they drew back and the Spanish took over that siege. It was the army of the reserve of Andalusia, I think, under Enrique O'Donnell and Carlos de España, who came up then. But the French garrison there, as Nick has said, was a powerful one under General Louis Cassin. 4,000 men were in there. And as Nick has so rightly said, 80 guns, 80 field guns in there. And it actually took 4 months eventually to capture Pamplona, of course. And one of the reasons was that, in fact, just before the Battle of Vitoria, the French had managed to run in a convoy with plentiful food supplies. And eventually they were starved out, but that was what happened eventually. But the other thing is that Wellington didn't send his heavy guns to Pamplona. He actually only sent, I think, 12-pounder guns captured at Vitoria from the French to help in the siege. So there was a slight imbalance there, I suppose.
Yes, I think it's also worth adding here, you got two massive fortresses, one, as we've now pointed out, with 4,000 men, the other one with 3,000 men. Why didn't Wellington besiege them both? Why did he blockade Pamplona and take the 6th Division away and put the Spanish there, who did a very good job, it's fair to say, of their blockade? Why didn't he besiege them both? Well, the simple answer is he didn't have two siege trains. He's faced with a choice. He's moving his siege train around by sea, and therefore there's the first clue as to why he chooses San Sebastián and not an inland location where he's got to move that very heavy, cumbersome siege train, all the ammunition and all the stores, the siege stores. But also, it's fair to say that San Sebastián sat on or very close to that Béarn chaussée, that main artery that came through from the Western Pyrenees into Spain. And therefore, from his perspective, that was the location that he wanted to take first. That gave him both an ingress, but also an egress route should he need it very, very quickly. And we also have to bear in mind, and we'll see this for the subsequent operations, Wellington always kept either his left foot or his right foot near to or in the sea. And he did that because, of course, his Royal Navy, or the Royal Navy, not his, but the Royal Navy had naval supremacy by this stage. Although it's fair to say that the French conducted some extremely audacious operations in that right-hand corner of the Bay of Biscay down there, running the gauntlet from Béarn and Bordeaux with small ships, gunboats into San Sebastián, even during the period of the siege itself. But it's a point worth making as to why he blockades one and besieges the other. Maya is a slightly different battle. Daddy Hill, Roland Hill, has got responsibility for the sort of left wing, if you like. He was one of the few people, along with Marshal Beresford, that Wellington had full confidence in, it's fair to say. And we see some interesting interpersonal relationships that developed during this period of the Peninsular War with, in particular, his divisional commanders who've been at his right or left shoulder throughout the war. These are not men that have just been parachuted in. They've been with him throughout the war. And yet here we have Lowry Cole, an extremely capable individual who, want of a better word, bottles it at Roncesvalles. We have Picton, a real fiery Welshman and an extremely brave man who, again, they get into a sort of huddle halfway down the road in the dark of the 25th, 26th of July and decide, let's pull back. That's not how we would remember Picton, certainly from his contribution to the Battle of Vitoria just a few weeks earlier. But at Maya, the commander in charge is none other than William Stewart. And William Stewart's an interesting man, a man that Wellington had all sorts of run-ins with throughout the Peninsular War. He didn't really want Stuart commanding a division, but nonetheless, Stuart is now commanding the 2nd Division. He once wrote of him that it's necessary that Stuart should be under the particular charge of somebody. And of course, that somebody was Rowland Hill. But of course, in the mountains, it's very difficult to make sure that people are doing what you've tasked them or ordered them to do. And of course, in the morning of the 25th, when those initial attacks begin over in the towards the east, the passes at Roncesvalles, Stuart thinks, oh, there's something going on over there, gets on his horse with a few of his aides-de-camp and rides off over to the east, leaving his 2 brigades, Pringle's and Cameron's brigades, without the divisional commander at the very point then that the attack then comes in at the Gorospiel. There are 2 advance routes up onto the pass at Maya. There's the Chemin d'Anglais, which is the long winding road slightly further over to the east. And then there's the main road. And it's up the Chemin d'Anglais that the d'Erlon's forces start to move up, if I've got this right. I think it was Moransin who came up the main road. Cameron is holding the Chemin d'Anglais, while Pringle has got responsibility for the main road and the main pass. And there is a small peak there, the Gorospiel, on which a small picket was located. And that picket gets attacked quite early in the morning. It's being provided by Captain Moyle Shearer, 90 of his men. That's overrun by about 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. And then they push back onto Cameron's brigade. Cameron's other battalions, which are in the village of Mayo, about 2 kilometers to the south, they've got to move extremely quickly and get into position to try and block the French. But it's almost impossible to hold back because you've got 2 divisions, one after the other, that are holding that pass or pushing that pass at Maya. And it's there that, of course, you've got this extraordinary action with the 91st holding that pass at Maya itself.
To sort of flag what we're about to discuss, the quote I found, which I found was fascinating, was historian Jack Weller, who called the stand of the first 92nd one of the greatest feats in military history. Maybe you could follow up on that, perhaps yourself, Marcus.
Well, I'll let Nick come in on the quote itself, but certainly Cameron's brigade, which, as Nick said, was part of that 2nd Division under William Stewart, it suffered the highest casualties of any brigade in this encounter. And the Gordon Highlanders had the highest regimental casualties, I think some 350 killed, wounded or missing. And the pass was held with the assistance of Portuguese artillery. There was a Portuguese artillery brigade there as well. But the French got through. I think they actually used an alternative track to get in behind, and they brushed aside the picket, as Nick has said. And Stuart had to withdraw, and he lost his guns. He lost his 4 guns there. So the Allied position was saved, really, by the fact that the French advances, both at Maya and Roncesvalles, were conducted very slowly. And the problem for Soult was, and for anyone who knows these mountains, the problem was that in places, the army could only advance in a very narrow formation, and sometimes even sort of single file almost. And that was a real problem for Soult. So I'll let Nick come back in there.
Yes, can I start by apologising to the Gordons by referring to the 91st? I meant the 92nd, of course. Yes, I mean, their feat on the Chemin, which is probably where they held it about a kilometre further to the southwest of the Gorospiel. It's an extraordinary piece of terrain in that it's about 5, maybe 10 meters wide on the top, and it literally just falls off either side. And so a small group of men on the crest facing towards the French, who were coming towards them from a sort of north easterly direction, were able to hold out, but they were taking fearful casualties, there's no doubt. And in fact, I have another quote here from George Bell of the 34th, who was down in the valley slightly to the south, part of Cameron's brigade, and was watching what was going on. And he said, that they stood there, referring, of course, to the 92nd. I'm going to get really told off. They stood there like a stone wall, overmatched by 20-1, until half their blue bonnets lay beside those brave northern warriors. When they retired, their dead bodies lay as a barrier to the advancing foe. Oh, but they did fight well that day. I can see the line now of the killed and wounded stretched upon the heather as the living retired, closing to the center. It was an extraordinary feat of heroism, but it couldn't last forever. And probably half an hour, maybe an hour, they held up those two divisions until basically, as Marcus has alluded, the French began to push around the flanks, although it was extremely difficult for them to do that. Pringle had also, from his position on the pass, been feeding troops along to support Cameron's troops, but in the end, it was just the sheer weight of numbers that won the day. It's at this point that our good friend William Stewart arrives back on the position to find that both Pringle and Cameron had actually held the situation, but he's now forced to pull back onto the main road at Maya to a first defensive position, which he does, concentrating his two brigades. But by now you've got the guts of 3 French divisions that are pushing on towards them. Marcus has made the point that Cuna's Portuguese guns were in a tremendously good position. They had been able to provide enfilade fire from a defilade position on the Chemin d'Anglais. They were in a slightly more precarious position up on a precipice, in fact, and firing down on Moranson's men as he was pushing up onto the pass. But it did mean that de Cunha had to abandon those guns as the French pushed forward. And Wellington made a great thing of this, because they were in fact the first guns that he had ever lost in battle, which for Wellington was a significant thing. It almost became a personal desire for him never to lose guns. Anyway, look, to cut a long story short, the reserves of the 7th Division now come up. Light is beginning to fade, and it's Barnes' brigade that arrives first. Stuart throws them straight in against Moranson's leading vanguard troops. And in fact, there is a feeling that D'Erlon had this feeling that the whole of the 7th brigade had arrived, a 7th division had arrived, I beg your pardon, and therefore he chose to hold any more attacks for that evening. And it's at that point that the fighting sort of peters out, and during the night Hill then withdraws. He doesn't pull back as far as Cole and Picton had done over to the east at Roncesvalles, but nonetheless he pulls back sufficiently far enough for the French to advance and to take pretty much the pass of Maya.
So it seems like this attack by Soult's forces was tactically quite successful, but what did it actually achieve for them?
The salient point really is that Wellington comes across from the east and takes control here. And in a nutshell, they fight 2 major encounters in and around Sorauren, north of Pamplona, over 3 days. And the end result is that Soult realizes he's getting nowhere and he retires back across the Pyrenees. That's it in a nutshell. And furthermore, I mean, Soult lost over 10,000 men, and the initial surprise had been offset by the slow advance. So Soult now had a dispirited and somewhat chaotic army. But once again, he sets about reorganizing and preparing to defend France. Soult was perhaps lucky in that Wellington was waiting on developments in Central Europe. And Wellington, Nick's mentioned earlier on that the siege of San Sebastián was suspended while this fighting was going on. And in reality, it doesn't get properly organized and reinvested again until the 25th or 26th of August. So there's a long delay here. And Wellington is, as I say, waiting on what's happening in Northern Europe. And meanwhile, Soult is preparing earthworks and redoubts along the French frontier, along that part of the lower part of the Pyrenees, at the western end of the Pyrenees. It's a linear defense, but he's a good organizer. And it's not right to compare this with Torres Vedras, because he didn't have the time or the men or the equipment to do that. But this is what Soult is now doing.
If I can return, though, very quickly to, did Soult achieve anything with the battles of the Pyrenees? Really, Soult had two objectives: lifting the siege at San Sebastián and also capturing Pamplona. He succeeds in the first, he fails in the second. But he's also pushed Wellington's forces. He's tested them in the Pyrenees. I think Wellington would have been reasonably pleased with the outcome. My view is that Sorauren was a battle lost by Soult and Soult's forces, not helped by the fact that d'Erlon didn't push on from the pass at Maille and come down the road slightly to the west, which is in fact the one that Soult takes to extract his army, having failed to force Wellington's army at Sorauren. But I think Wellington would have also been somewhat concerned with the performance of some of his divisional commanders: Stuart, the 2nd Division, Picton, the 3rd Division, and Cole, the 4th Division, in terms of their performance in independent command, because what Wellington is more than aware is that he's got to give much more freedom of maneuver. It's forced to, because of the terrain, to give much more freedom of maneuver to these divisional commanders. And I don't think he would have been hugely enamored by their performance, by some of them, and their performance to that point.
And so the Peninsular War is still not over. There's more hard fighting to come. In 2 weeks, I'm going to post a short episode looking at the siege of San Sebastián, and then at the end of April, we will finally wrap everything up with the invasion of France and the end of the war. Before I go today, I just want to say a big thank you to Nick and Marcus, who will be back with us for the rest of this journey into France. They both have books out that may interest you, including Marcus's new one on General Sir Denis Pack. That looks excellent.